Funny how the media covers white riots versus black protests.
Breaking news.
Seems like when the protesters are black, the media uses some pretty harsh words.
The bad guys.
Lawlessness, looting,
wild animals,
criminals, and thugs.
Thugs. Isn't it the right word?
However, if you're white and you're tearing up the city because of a game, you're just young people.
Young people danced on a flipped-over car.
As UK fans did stupid things.
Some maybe got a little out of control.
Seeing a scene like this just shows how passionate the UK fans are.
It's so tough to lose, and unfortunately the ugly side that we sometimes see in sports.
And notice how the police always show up to a black protest in military-grade equipment, and yet the media claims they're just doing nothing.
It's inexplicable why the police are doing nothing.
Let's mobilize the National Guard.
If I'm a rioter and I see the police doing nothing, I might feel like I have a license.
You would.
But at white riots, the cops actually are standing around doing nothing.
Another group of cops over there just standing there.
No one was really doing anything.
These guys look like they could be watching a parade. And why is it that the leadership of the black community is always called into question?
Where is the leadership?
Leadership.
The black leadership.
The absence of leadership.
And it goes back to leadership, but that leadership has to come from the community.
But no one ever questions the leadership of white parents who let their kids burn down and vandalize their college campus.
These are just young college students who think they're playing some kind of a game with police officers.
You know, sometimes they don't even call a white riot a riot.
Party gone awry.
Some fans got a bit too rowdy after the win.
A dispute, a bloody brawl.
There was some type of altercation.
Waco, 170 arrested, 9 people dead.
They're not thugs.
Baltimore, no deaths, but it's a riot, chock full of thugs.
Thugs.
Just thugs.
What if the media portrayed white rioters the same as black protesters? Let's switch the audio and see how it plays out.
Breaking news, violent protest.
What you're looking at is the unraveling of the civil society.
Criminals and thugs.
And they're raising hell, and they're destroying property.
These idiotic thugs, rioting and looting, are hurting their own people.
Wild animals burning buildings down.
Especially if they know the media's all there, right? Got the cameras on everyone. It's become its own reality show.
Who acts like that towards a police officer?
Think for yourself. Don't let racist media color your perceptions. Demand fairness in media coverage. Tell the media to put an end to calling black people thugs.
For our research project, our group would like to examine the ways in which media, more specifically television news media, handles and treats the topic of race when it comes to news stories. We would like to particularly examine how narratives of news stories are distorted and changed based on a person's racial background, and to a certain extent class and socioeconomic background. Some of the instances of racial bias we will cover include, but are not limited to, how leaders of different racial groups are portrayed differently during natural disasters, the use of racially charged dog whistle terms such as referring to black athletes as thugs, changing the narrative of black unarmed police shooting victims by white cops by looking at irrelevant past drug use or old photos, referring to adult white criminals as boys to suggest innocence or unawareness of the law, while simultaneously referring to black teen criminals as adults, using cases of undocumented criminals to paint broad strokes about larger communities, and much more. In many news stories, images are used as a powerful and memorable way of shaping a story. The prevailing and controlling images in the news media have a lasting effect on public perception. As you will see in our video and presentation, the way in which the news media harnesses the power of imagery, along with selective and suggestive word choices, shapes public opinion and controls the national discourse. The photo above is a representation of the media's portrayal of race. The Charleston church shooter is shown in a more sympathetic light with accompanying headlines than a young man who was one of 9 murder victims. The focus for this part of the video is the language used to describe white murderers versus the language used to describe black victims of murder, and how the use of different wording can make mass murderers seem like misled teenagers who went down the wrong path, and murder victims seem like they deserve their fate because how they are framed in the media. Irrelevant background information is used to demonize black victims and humanize white murderers. James Eagle Holmes is an example of this. He was described as a brilliant science student in major news outlets when referring to his brutal slaughter of 12 people, whereas Sandra Bland was described as having prior run-ins with the law, even though she was a victim of hate crimes by police. Furthermore, the amount of sympathy extended to Holmes was immense. His family and friends even testified to how good of a person he was, which is completely irrelevant when you murder 12 people. Meanwhile, in cases like Sandra Bland's, Black victims are crucified for any and everything in their past. This is just another way in which language frames the conversation about racially biased stereotypes. White murderers are often described as kids when they commit mass murder, in order to deflect the blame from their actions, while the same courtesy is not extended to people of color. Conversely, people of color are often wrongly described as adults, even if they are children, in order to make their crimes seem more heinous. Again, with the Holmes example, even though he was 24 when he stole the lives of 12 people and injured 70 others in a brutal rampage, he is referred to as a child in multiple media outlets. He's not the only white murderer extended this humanizing courtesy either. Here is another image of Nicholas Cruz being incorrectly referred to as a child, even though he was 18 at the time of the Parkland shooting. When a Black person commits a crime, a negative stereotype is attributed to the entire race, whereas when a white person commits a crime, he or she is described as a lone wolf, and this act is not considered a characteristic of the race as a whole. When looking at mass murder and police shootings, there are disparities in how both white and Black suspects and convicts are described in the news media. In the case of Nicholas Cruz, the 19-year-old white Parkland shooter who killed 17 people, his image is painted quite differently than that of Franklin Lee Barnes, an 18-year-old Black male who killed 4 people in an apartment complex shooting. In an ABC article, Cruz is described as a teenage orphan who is a broken human being. The article even references President Trump's tweet that claims that Cruz is mentally disturbed, and AGC describes Cruz as a broken child that is remorseful for the crime he has committed. NBC described Barnes as an 18-year-old gunman. It was additionally mentioned that he is a young man. News outlets typically take the time to describe white criminals such as Cruz in detail as a teenager who is suffering, while the media describes Black criminals such as Barnes as an adult male committing a serious crime. This is despite the fact that both are teenagers, and Cruz is also a year older than Barnes and committed a much more serious crime. When looking at both white and Black police officers who killed an unarmed civilian of a different race, there is a disparity in media representation of demeanor. Officer Noor killed an unarmed white woman, while Officer Slager killed an unarmed Black man. Throughout articles, Officer Noor's Somali origins are repeated numerous times. He is also described as having acted unreasonably and recklessly, along with abusive of his authority. Michael Slager's racial background is mentioned sparingly in news articles. He was also described as being remorseful and fearful of being tased when the incident took place. In Fox News, a conservative news outlet, Slager's race was never mentioned, even though the race of the victim was included. Images used in the media are used to show who the individual is that committed the crime, or show the individual that was a victim of a crime. However, African Americans and minorities are depicted differently than white Americans in the news media. This image is just one sole example of how the media displays white Americans with pictures of them usually well-dressed and smiling, whereas African Americans and minorities are displayed using their mugshots or looking as unapproachable. This falls into what Ellis Cashmore considers the American paradox, where both individuals who created the same crime should be viewed as the same, but in fact they are presented differently, thus creating real-life oppression. The news media displays pictures of African Americans that could be potentially questionable as to what the individuals do in their spare time, rather than images that display their everyday line of work. Cashmore quotes Eddie Harris's thoughts of how oppression is exemplified within America. To be Black is to be surrounded by those who remind you. This can be applied to our news media. Today, for example, the individual of the image questions, what picture would they use? Both of these could be shown in the news media. However, the image on the left with the individual wearing a chain making hand signs would be chosen over the right, with him suited in uniform reading to children. The media does this to illuminate that the crime that might have been made was a potential danger to someone of authority, or a more believable story for the public to be interested in. This portrayal of oppression is harmful to our society. This image exemplifies how society relates individuals with the crimes that have been committed. Specific terms are used in order to explain the reason why they did it. It is the media that provides these images that feed society to believe that individuals of a different race are related to violence because they continue to enforce that throughout their titles, whereas those who are white are seen as heroes or have emotional issues. Controlling images is a way in which the news media contributes to real-life oppression and the enhancement of stereotyping. This ABC News article tells a story about the same crime that was committed on the same day. However, each crime was committed by people of two different races. The images themselves that are used to tell different stories about who the individuals are. The image to the left displays a group of 3 white American boys who are neatly dressed in what is likely their university colors, whereas the other individuals, a group of African American boys, have their mugshots shown. Hall expresses that stereotypes continue to exist because it is society that makes the differences between races apparent. Therefore, controlling images such as these will continue to have an impact on American society as it continues to influence stereotypes through the media. We can see from the example of these magazines how stereotypes become heightened in the media by displaying 2 kids dressed completely different from one another to fit accordingly to the magazine title. The media represents minority individuals with images that make them look hostile and unpleasant. This is to make society see them as more credible for committing the crime. They usually use images to fit their headlines that are revealed with them. For example, in these images, Nicholas Cruz's brother, the Parkland shooter, was arrested under false pretenses. However, because he was of a minority and charged for being questionable, his picture was a mugshot. Whereas Nicholas Cruz, being his brother but of a different race, had a headline expressing that he was bullied and shows him in a different perspective, such as looking so sad that society could be empathetic. Hall's term of dominant ethnicities can be portrayed here as society constructs there to be one that is more influential than the other. This other is what the media will expose to society to be delinquent. Racial bias by executive producers of large news television networks plays a significant role in the decision-making of what story is featured on the news and also how they are featured. Many news outlets will continue to broadcast a popular story to the world because they know that the consumer will be more likely to watch it, and because it is consistent with the views and ideals of the television network. These stories are thus influenced by the racial biases of the producer, conscious of it or not, deciding which information to disseminate to the masses. This ultimately leads society to form a negative perception of blacks in the news media. Also, a focus on high television ratings and reporting only news stories that are tailored to fit the corporate agenda leads to a large misrepresentation of blacks in the news media. Illusions and false perceptions are often created due to network channels' inability to produce true journalistic work. This was true of the Stewart case in 1989, in which a black man was accused of robbing and shooting Charles Stewart and killing his wife, Carol Stewart. The news media coverage had created an illusion which represented Willie Bennett, the suspect, as a murderer, and the husband, Curtis Stewart, as an innocent victim. Although much was not known yet about the crime, news networks quickly formed stories to keep the public engaged and made them feel like they were informed about the issue. Many stories were ran claiming Bennett to be the murderer, until it later became known that the husband, Charles Stewart, had in fact been the one to murder his wife. After the truth had come out about the murder, the media then quickly shifted their approach to now create another news story for the public to focus on, which further improves television ratings. In his article, Racism, Hoaxes, Epistemology, and News as a Form of Knowledge, The Stewart Case as Fraud or Norm, Thomas Cooper demonstrated how during the Stewart case, in order to stay consistent with society's perception of the story, the Mission Hills community, an area with a mixture of ethnic groups including blacks, Asians, Hispanics, and many Caucasians, was depicted as primarily black. This is an example of how racial bias influences journalists of news media who do not search for the truth, but in fact seek to create an illusory reality that coincides with the values of the network television producers. In the Whittier Daily News, an article was written about Elliot Rodger, the man responsible for killing 6 innocent college students near the campus of UC Santa Barbara. This headline and picture demonstrates the bias shown towards white suspects as compared to black suspects. Deborah Smith, who once served as Rodger's principal at Independence High School, said she knew the young man for more than 2 years and was in shock and devastated to hear that the 2010 graduate had allegedly killed 6 young people in a Friday night rampage near UC Santa Barbara. After he was found to be guilty, people were still willing to touch on that they were shocked to hear he would commit such an act of violence, as if to give him the benefit of the doubt for murder. This article states that John Crawford was carrying an MK-177, a BB or pellet rifle. However, the weapon is also known as a variable pump air rifle, and it is highly unlikely that the MK-177 would be able to kill a human, but it can kill squirrels, snakes, rabbits, or small birds if aimed properly. Comparing this to the other article about Elliot Rodger, we can see that there is a clear discrimination because he was a black man. The article also displays the police officers who were involved in the shooting, as well as the toy gun that Crawford had been carrying. The article shows the officers dressed in their uniforms, and the article also claims that Crawford was in the store attempting to buy the toy gun while he was with his girlfriend. According to the article, the police told Crawford to get on the ground, and when he refused, they shot and killed him. The difference between these two cases is shown in how the media portrays the white suspect versus the black suspect. Local news and media may treat their coverage of a specific crime committed differently depending on the race of the person who committed it. One of the ways in which they do this is through the time spent discussing a certain crime and how it differs based upon the race of the offender. The media may try to create a bias by spending more time covering crime based upon race when the crime takes place in a community that is made up of mostly minorities. In an article from the University of Nebraska at Omaha, the authors state that by emphasizing crime in economically depressed neighborhoods, local newsrooms may reinforce stereotypes about minorities. This not only reinforces the stereotype about how minority communities have more crime, but it also provides a false identity for a community by leading the public and even sometimes the inhabitants of the community to believe that the community they live in is not as safe as others. A further example of how the news media will intentionally alter the coverage based on race is through the headlines and pictures that they will show and discuss on screen. There are countless examples of how these may differ depending on race. However, the news media's depiction of how they cover crimes based on race is not completely unnoticed. As Nick Wing of the Huffington Post pointed out, the controversy surrounding the media depiction of Trayvon Martin, who was gunned down by neighborhood watchman George Zimmerman in a high-profile case, caused people on social media to wonder what type of picture the news would show if they were to be shot as well. A hashtag that stated, #IfTheyGunMeDown, began trending, and it helped people to notice the bias that the media has when covering crimes between people of differing race. This shows how much power the news media has when selecting a picture of a victim or a suspect of a crime. It also shows how easily they can create an unfair depiction of a person and create a bias depending on race. There is obviously a difference in the way in which crime is covered on the news depending on the race of the person who commits it. Due to the media and news trying to create or even reinforce stereotypes about minorities in their communities, they will sometimes intentionally decide to cover the story differently and emphasize certain details for a longer duration of time in order to satisfy their agenda. Hopefully, we can start to resist the racist agenda by the news media and have fair depictions when covering crimes for all races.
What people see and hear in the media has a tremendous effect on their lives, has a tremendous effect on decisions they make, from decisions that are made in the schoolhouse to the courthouse. If you were to believe local news in New York, you would think that 72% of assaults were committed by black folks. But that number is not even close to correct when you compare it to NYPD arrest records. This type of overrepresentation, sends a message that it's okay and it's justified to fear black folks. It sends a message about who black people are that is, harmful and hurtful. And we see the stark contrast between crime that's actually happening and what the media is actually showing. The idea that our media represents this two New Yorks, this New York where some people are going to be treated fairly and equitably and some people are not, then that then plays out in our criminal justice system with policies like broken windows and stop and frisk. Make no mistake, news directors, reporters have a ton of stories to choose from. The decisions that are made in those bullpens inside of local news stations impact people's psyche every single day. It's something that we cannot overlook. All of this information, all of this data points to the fact that local news can do better. And we stand ready to sit at the table and help them make it happen.